Thank you, Eileen, and everyone at Old Dominion for having me. So today, let me just organize my boxes here so you're not blocking me. Today, the title of my talk is Right Whale Conservation, Ecology, and Technology. So, there we go. You see a slide shift and everything? Looks good on your end?
Looks good, yeah.
Great. So a quick introduction to the North Atlantic right whale. They were heavily whaled for centuries, especially 16, 17, 1800s. But there's been a moratorium on whaling for 100 years. So when right whales were subject to commercial whaling, they were actually named the right whale because they were considered the right whale to hunt. The reasons for this are because their habitat was quite close to shore, which of course means it's easier for vessels to find right whales. And they have a lot of blubber. So when they're killed, they actually float, as opposed to other baleen whales, which have less blubber and sink when they're dead. So that makes it easier to process the animal. They're also pretty slow moving. So they were just generally a pretty good target. And for that reason, the population was decimated. It brings us to 100 years ago, and despite almost 100 years of protection, the population has really struggled to bounce back. So today there's an estimated 340 animals in the species remaining, which puts them at being classified as critically endangered. The reason they haven't bounced back despite 100 years of protection is because they're getting hit by vessels, they're getting tangled up in fishing gear. Those two mechanisms are the main reasons that they have high mortality rates. But most of my work looks at prey limitation and how years of prey limitation impact their demography. So we're going to dive into that today. Right whales feed on copepods, and primarily they feed on a specific copepod called Calanus finmarchicus. So that would make them ecological specialists. They really target a single prey group. Even more specific, they really only eat adult life stage Calanus finmarchicus. And the reason for that is kind of interesting. Calanus, these copepods, they hibernate. They go into what's called diapause. Often over the winter period. And so to build up the energy to nourish themselves during this hibernation, they build up a fat sac. And so this sac of lipid makes them really caloric. So they're actually a lot more nutritious than the other prey of similar size in the region. So right whales eat Calanus. And though this map here on your right shows you, hopefully you can see my mouse moving, it shows you where right whales feed. So right whales have been known to feed in the Gulf of Maine area. They tend to feed in the springs here in Cape Cod Bay. In the summer, they may go up to the Bay of Fundy. In the fall, they'll feed off the Scotian Shelf. There's a critical habitat here called Roseway Basin. And then in the winter, we're not sure where all of the animals go, but a subset of the population will migrate south to a calving ground off the coast of Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. Now, what's important about this migration is it's undergone by females that are pregnant because they're giving birth off the coast here of Florida. And during this migration and during their time spent in the calving ground, they have no prey available. So they're fasting for this few-month period during the reproductive migration. And in the next few slides, I want to show you the link that we found between their prey availability, so Calanus finmarchicus, and right whale reproduction rates. So this is a really fantastic system to work on because the data is incredible. Right whales, partly because there's only 340 remaining, we know pretty much every animal in the entire species. If you see here in this image of right whales, you can see these white patches on their head, and those are called callosities. And these white patches look different for each individual, which makes it possible for us to identify every individual in the population from a photograph. So it's a really great data set for a species that's been collected consistently for over 40 years. On the right, this is one example of some of the great data that we have of the abundance of their prey. So this is the continuous plankton recorder. It's sometimes called the CPR. The CPR is pictured here in the bottom right, and it's a really simple little box that just has a piece of silk gauze that gets dragged through the water, pretty shallow behind a ship of opportunity. And ships have been dragging this continuous plankton recorder between Boston and Nova Scotia around once a month for the past 60 years. And so we can pull the bugs off of that gauze and identify them taxonomically and also to their life stage. And so then we can get at how much adult stage Calanus finmarchicus is in the water each month over this 60-year time series across the Gulf of Maine. Now, Calanus, it's this tiny bug, smaller than a grain of rice, and right whales need to eat a really dense patch of it. And Calanus varies really dramatically in where it is in the world, its density, and its abundance. And part of the things we've been trying to accomplish is understand what causes changes in the abundance of these adult copepods. And one mechanism that we think really matters for Calanus in the Gulf of Maine, where right whales are feeding, originates all the way up in the Arctic. So here on the left, we've got an image of circulation patterns in the Arctic. And you can see here this swirling Beaufort gyre labeled BG. And it's this mound of fresh water. Fresh because of a lot of terrestrial precipitation runoff into the Arctic Ocean. And this gyre contains a lot of fresh water, but the climate in this area operates in these decadal phases, where some phases the Beaufort gyre is larger and is storing a lot of fresh water. And in other phases, the gyre gets spun down and it releases a lot of fresh water. And when that fresh water gets released, it takes some time to trickle through the Canadian Arctic archipelago and comes around Labrador, and eventually, a couple of years later, enters into the Gulf of Maine. So we see these periods of freshwater storage and release captured here in the AOO index. So the storage periods are in red and the release periods are in blue. And we see in the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, we went through a storage, freshwater release, and then freshwater storage pattern. And we think that might be linked to changes in the abundance of the adult stage of this copepod in the Gulf of Maine, as captured by that continuous plankton recorder on the last page. So pay attention to this pattern in the time series. There were a lot of copepods, so right whale prey in the 80s. And then when that fresh water hit the Gulf of Maine, the copepod, the adult stage copepods, really declined. And then in the 2000s, when the Beaufort gyre entered this period of storage again, the copepods increased again. So here on this next slide, we're looking at that same pattern at the top time series figure here on the left. So this is the same time series, Copepods are high in the 80s, low in the 90s, and high in the 2000s. And if you look below that, we've got that same time period, an index of right whale calf birth efficiency. So all this is the number of calves born in a given year divided by the number of right whale mothers that were available to reproduce. So it's really simple, but it captures the fact that right whales have a multi-year reproduction cycle, and you want to capture the reproductive dynamics for a given year and how they associate with changes in prey abundance. And you can see that this calving index mirrors the prey index really carefully. In the 80s, when prey was high, calf births were high. In the 90s, when prey was low, calving rates declined. And then in the 2000s, when prey rebounded, the calf rates rebounded a bit. Very simply on the right side, this is just the right whale population size over this 30-year period. And when calf births were high, in the 1980s, the population was growing. In the 1990s, when calf births slowed down, the population growth slowed down. And then in the 2000s, when the population increased, when the calf births increased, the population increased. This seems really simple, but it's important to understand no matter how complicated demographics get, ultimately a population size is just a function of births and deaths. It's really important to factor in changes in birth rates if you're going to understand population dynamics. So to get into this prey-driven change in reproduction with a little bit more precision, I built this 3-stage model that follows a mother through a 3-year reproduction cycle. So a typical reproduction cycle for a right whale looks like a year feeding and building up blubber layers, a full year of pregnancy, and a full year of nursing a newborn calf. So an idealized reproduction cycle for an individual whale would look like giving birth every 3 years. And so I built this model to allow a whale to give birth every 3 years, but also to allow a whale to get stuck in this blubber building phase, or even to get pregnant and then to get kicked back into the blubber building phase because of a prenatal or a neonatal mortality. And when I built that model, I tested it to see, can we understand these transitions between reproductive states better with just a simple model where these transitions are set as a consistent probability? Or will the model be improved if the probability is dependent on prey as measured from that continuous plankton recorder? And so I'm really breezing through these results because I have a lot of newer work to say, to tell you about. But this top time series here, the black line is the same in the top and bottom, and it's the true number of right whale births over this time period. And the blue line in the top time series is a null model where reproduction rates are held constant. And the bottom time series with the red model shows how much more precise a model is at capturing right whale reproduction dynamics when it's driven by prey. So this was a really clear indicator that prey was driving the interannual variability in right whale reproduction. I built a much more complex model that we're not really going to spend time on today, but it's over here on the right-hand side, where I formally tested the question, is prey driving mortality? And it's not. Prey is not driving mortality rates, it's only driving reproduction rates, which makes sense given our observations. We don't really see right whales emaciating and starving to death unless there's a different issue. If they have fishing gear entangled in their mouth, then they have a lot of difficulty getting food, and then those animals might emaciate and starve. Okay, so the reason, really the underlying driver that I wanted to start digging into this relationship between right whales and prey is because I thought right whale prey distribution was going to start to change. Right when I started my graduate work, this paper came out, published by Ray Gondot. So this is in 2010. And this top map shows the distribution of Calanus finmarchicus over the North Atlantic. And you can see, hopefully you can see my mouse, there's a red dot here at the very southwestern part of the distribution. This is the Calanus that right whales feed on in the Gulf of Maine. But most of the distribution of Calanus is actually much farther north. And of course, with climate change, we're seeing a lot of poleward distribution shifts. And so Ray Gondot modeled the spatial distribution of Calanus in 2050 and 2100. And here in 2050, we see that red dot that should be Calanus concentrations in the Gulf of Maine has completely disappeared. So my concern was that as climate change progresses and Calanus shifts farther north, right whales would no longer have access to prey in the Gulf of Maine. My guess, back before the data that I'm going to show you now, my guess is what was going to happen is right whales would shift farther north so that they could continue to forage on this copepod. But then their migration route down to their calving ground in the southeast US was going to get longer. And I was worried about the energetic consequences of that lengthened migration. So now we'll see what really happened. So as many of you probably know, the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 99% of the global ocean. This is a nice figure that was published by a colleague of mine, Andy Pershing, showing the rate of warming across the globe. And you see this red box right here in the Gulf of Maine. And of course, given the previous slide, that might have implications for the speed of this poleward distribution shift of Calanus finmarchicus. So right as I was publishing that larger demographic model I showed a few slides back, the right whales entered what's called an unusual mortality event, or a UME. So in a typical year, we would normally find 2, 3, or 4 right whale carcasses. And there's a little time series I really liked from NOAA that shows this. So from 2012 to 2017, and the blue bars are right whale carcasses found in US waters, and the red bars are right whale carcasses found in Canadian waters. So we would typically see, you know, maybe 3, maybe 4 carcasses, and most of them would be found in US waters. But in 2017, the UME was declared when 17 carcasses were found. And maybe even more interesting than that number of carcasses is the location. And so you can see in this red bar, they were mostly found in Canadian waters, but they weren't found here in the Bay of Fundy or off the Scotian Shelf, which are the Canadian waters that right whales used to inhabit. They were found up here in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So 12 right whale carcasses were found either floating or beached in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The reason that there were so many bodies that year is because right whales shifted unexpectedly and began to use the Gulf of St. Lawrence as a new habitat. And because they were there and we didn't expect it, there were no policies in place to protect right whales there. So that means that there were no policies to slow vessels down. There were no policies to mitigate fishing gear in the water. And so there was this mismatch between right whale distribution and protective policy implementation. And so for that, we've got this 2017 UME to blame. I would guess that those who have been listening are probably starting to connect the dots, but this was a big call to arms for me to better understand the motivation behind this rapid distribution shift. So the first thing that we did is look at changes in the right whale calving index. So right whales were having a pretty good decade from 2000 to 2010, which we talked about a bit earlier. But right in 2010, right whale births started to decline. And they remained at low levels up until the end of this most recent decade. So here we've got the right whale calving index that we've talked about, and we see that there was a relative high in the 80s, low in the 90s, high in the 2000s, and then a low in the 2010s that really matched the low of the 1990s. Pretty sadly, right after 2017, when 17 carcasses were found in Gulf of St. Lawrence and Gulf of Maine areas, the following calving season had 0 calf births. And never on record was there a year when 0 calves were born in the Southeast US. So it was pretty bad news, and the decline in calf rates indicated that it actually was most likely a prey problem. So we tried to investigate this, and we were interested in understanding the oceanographic drivers. We didn't see anything that looked like a great salinity anomaly from the Arctic. And so we looked in other places, and we ended up seeing a change in the Gulf Stream. So that can be shown through this Gulf Stream index. Here we've got a time series from 1980 to 2020. And the Gulf Stream index essentially is saying how far north is the path of the Gulf Stream when it turns away from the US and towards Europe across the North Atlantic. So in these bars, when there's a really tall red bar, that means the Gulf Stream has shifted farther north than its usual trajectory. And that was pretty interesting. If you've heard of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, that is, the Gulf Stream is a part of this greater movement of water across the Atlantic and actually across the whole Earth. So the oceans are driven by what's often called the global ocean conveyor belt. Oh, sorry about that. And the driver of that conveyor belt occurs in the North Atlantic, where water gets cold because it's close to the poles, and the Atlantic is the saltiest of the oceans. And so cold, salty water is the densest kind of water, and dense water is going to sink from the surface down to the depths of the ocean. And so the North Atlantic, because it's the saltiest ocean, the parts closer to the pole where the water is colder is where most of the water sinks from the surface currents down to the deep currents in the ocean. And it's thought to be the driver of global ocean circulation. Of course, climate change is causing Earth's waters to warm. And then in the polar areas, all of the ice melt is also causing the waters to freshen. So as the waters warm and freshen, they become less dense, more buoyant, and it slows down the driving engine of the global ocean conveyor belt. The Gulf Stream is just a part of the surface circulation that's connected to this larger conveyor belt. And one of the things that have been hypothesized and modeled is that the Gulf Stream is going to slow down, it's going to get wider, and it's going to get lazier as that North Atlantic engine slows down. And so that's what we think that we're seeing. The Gulf Stream, as it widens and starts to meander because the engine that's driving it has slowed down, parts of that warm water have the opportunity to entrain themselves into the Gulf of Maine through the deep channels. So here's like the Northeast Channel. The Gulf Stream doesn't run quite up to the surface. Most of it is just a bit below the surface. And so a lot of this entrainment is actually occurring at depth. Here we looked at a time series to really understand, is this shift in the path of the Gulf Stream, is it actually causing a warming in these deep waters in the Gulf of Maine? And it turns out it seems to be. So there's a really nice data set that's managed by the Bedford Institute of Oceanography. And they're looking at, I don't know why it keeps shifting on me, but they're looking at water temperature in deep areas in the basins and on the slope around the Gulf of Maine. So by deep, I mean like 150 to 200 meters deep. And when we look at the water temperature in these deep areas on the slope and in the basins, we find that since 2010, these deep waters are warmer than they have been since this index started to be measured in the 1980s. So this is some indication that we're actually seeing warming in these deeper areas. Finally, and this part was pretty tricky, we wanted to look at the continuous plankton recorder and see if Calanus had indeed declined in the Gulf of Maine in the most recent decade. And it's tricky because funding crises caused the continuous plankton recorder to stop running. So we pulled some money together to process samples that have been sitting on shelves, but we could only go up until 2017 because the continuous plankton recorder stopped running after that. But when we processed that data, we found that the late stage, the adult Calanus finmarchicus, had entered another regime of low availability in the Gulf of Maine. So that's shown here, where that CPR, the continuous plankton recorder index, has been updated up until 2017, and we see these low blue bars. This dashed black line across the time series was driven by that three-stage reproduction model I introduced earlier, which essentially says prey that's below this threshold of about 0.75, negative 0.75, is so low that even pregnant adult females are likely to lose their calf. Prey levels that are not as severely low as that threshold are still going to cause a decline in pregnancy rates. So we've hit that criteria in the early 2010s. So I'm just stacking all these time series that I've introduced to you together, where we see the Gulf Stream Index showing that in 2010, the Gulf Stream started to meander farther north. The Regional Slope Water Temperature Index showing that the water temperature at 200 meters got a lot warmer starting 2010. The Calanus Index showing that the prey that right whales eat started to decline around 2010. And the right whale calving index, which shows that females that are available to reproduce are not reproducing starting around 2010. So it seems like there was an oceanographic regime shift that occurred in 2010, and the driver is most likely anthropogenic climate change, as opposed to the climate mechanism I introduced earlier with the great salinity anomalies in the Beaufort Gyre. That's more natural climate change. So really simply here, we're looking at another estimate of the right whale population size from 1990 to 2020. And that population was growing up until about 2010, and then it exhibited this decline. In this time series on the right, I break that down into changes in births and deaths. So in that first decade of the 2000s, right whales were giving birth to about 20 calves a year. But in the more recent decade, in the 2010s, right whales were giving birth to maybe 10 calves a year and down to 0 calves in 2018. So that's shown in these blue bars, that decline in births. But then also when you factor in that unusual mortality event that started in 2017 when 17 carcasses were found, right whale deaths have actually increased a lot. In 2019, there was another, so this unusual mortality event is ongoing because the death and the serious injury rate remains high. We wanted to get some more detail in how Calanus was declining and if there were any interesting patterns in the spatial extent or the seasonal variation. And the way we chose to do that is we broke the Gulf of Maine and the Scotian Shelf and the Gulf of St. Lawrence into these polygons. And these polygons might not be very meaningful for you. Like here in pink, we've got Cape Cod Bay, GB is Georges Bank, RB is Roseway Basin, which I've mentioned a few times, BOF is Bay of Fundy, GSL is the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So these polygons were chosen because they have significance to right whales and how right whales use their habitat. Over here on the right, we see the Southeast US calving habitat. So we won't talk too much about that, but that's the critical habitat where the females are giving birth off of Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. So we broke space into these polygons and looked at changes in right whale sightings per unit effort. If you are a fishery person, you might be used to the term CPUE or catch per unit effort. And it's really the same thing that we're looking at, except for we're not catching the right whales, we're just observing them. But this is an example of what the raw-ish data look like. So this example is compiling the months of April, May, and June together. So the springtime months. And on the left are right whale sightings per unit effort in the 2000s. And on the right are right whale sightings in the 2010s. So the Bay of Fundy, there were plenty of whales there in the spring, and that declined in this most recent decade. And then interestingly, especially for some of the work that Eileen and I have been thinking about together with wind energy, in the 2000s, there were very few right whales found south of Cape Cod Bay, where wind development is occurring. But in the 2010s, a lot more right whales were observed in that area. So this is sort of what the raw data look like. But what I did is I built a distinct model to model right whale sightings per unit effort for every single spatial polygon in every single month to compare, are right whales using this space more in the 2000s or more in the 2010s? And so this heat map here shows you the model results, where blue boxes say that there are more right whales using that space in the 2000s. And red boxes are places where more whales are using that space in the 2010s. The dark black line around some of the boxes shows areas where the models were significant. And so each of these boxes is really meaningful if you are developing policies to protect right whales. But to take sort of a step back, the main trends that I want you to see is these red boxes around Cape Cod Bay and Massachusetts Bay in the winter and spring months are indicating that more right whales are using Cape Cod Bay than have in the previous decade. And they're using Cape Cod Bay to feed in the spring for longer. In fact, they're starting to feed into the early summer, right? April is month 4, May is month 5. These blue boxes up here, they correspond to the Bay of Fundy and Roseway Basin. And it shows what we've seen, which is that right whales are really declining in their use of these summertime and fall foraging habitats. So that's great. Looking at sort of detailed changes in right whale distribution between these 2 decades. But what I really wanted to do is look at prey as well and see how prey was changing between these 2 decades. And so because of the spatial resolution of these polygons, the continuous plankton recorder wasn't really going to be enough for this purpose. So I switched over to using the Ecomon dataset, which some of you might be familiar with. But instead of just that continuous plankton recorder, which is dragged near the surface, these are water column integrated net tows. So you can see bongo nets here on the right-hand side. All these black dots are locations where these net tows occurred for the Ecomon program over the 30-year time series. We're not talking about the 1990s in this talk, but I did all this work for the 1990s as well. But the black dots are where Ecomon net surveys occurred. The red dots are where Canada's a similar program that Canada implemented called the AZMP, the Atlantic Zonal Meridional Program, where they're also doing net tows and counting the bugs that they catch in the nets in these locations. So I looked at copepod, late stage copepod abundance data in all of these areas. So here, this heat map is the one we've already talked over with the whale on it. And here this is showing, you know, in red, there were more whales in the 2010s, and in blue, there were more whales in the 2000s. But here on the left, this is another heat map, which is looking at copepods. So specifically late stage or adult Calanus finmarchicus using the Ecomon. And I should actually make this into 2 slides. The first thing you should notice from this heat map is that most of the boxes are blue. So Calanus in general declined in the Gulf of Maine, Scotian Shelf areas in the 2010s compared to the 2000s. But in the spring, so Q2, that's when we see a lot of red boxes. And that's pretty interesting. The red boxes we're seeing are corresponding to Cape Cod Bay and Jeffrey's Ledge, which is just a bit north of Cape Cod Bay. And that corresponds to this increase in right whale use of that area in the spring. So perhaps right whales are spending more time in Cape Cod Bay and staying there longer in the spring because of this relative increase in prey availability. But then here, looking back at our whales, these blue boxes showed that right whales stopped using the Bay of Fundy and Roseway Basin in the summer and fall. And those correspond to blue boxes in our copepod heat map. because the Calanus, the adult stage Calanus finmarchicus, really declined in that area over the summer and fall quarters. So that's what these blue boxes indicate for the Bay of Fundy, for Jeffreys Ledge, for the Gulf of Maine, and for Roseway Basin. Like I said, I don't know why this is out of control. I think there's some timing issue. Just give me a second. I'm here. Okay, this heat map here in the upper right is using Canada's AZMP program. So that's most of these don't matter. Halifax, Prince 5, Rimouski. I want you to focus on Shadiac. So SHED is Shadiac Valley. That's where right whales are feeding in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. But all of these boxes are blue, including the Shadiac Valley boxes. And what that means is that Calanus finmarchicus was declining in the Gulf of St. Lawrence at the same time that it was declining in the Gulf of Maine. So this leads us to this question: right whales, are they really getting the prey that they need when they go to the Gulf of St. Lawrence? And an important thing to note about this decline in prey in the Gulf of St. Lawrence is that it's not as though this increase in prey was drawing right whales to the area. It's just that a decrease in prey in the Gulf of Maine was causing right whales to abandon their traditional foraging habitat. So I think that this idea of trying to separate the push versus the pull is pretty important, because we need to better understand what triggers right whales to make these shifts in their foraging. So this is some work that a student of mine did to essentially say that right whales that are using the Gulf of St. Lawrence, if a right whale mother is using the Gulf of St. Lawrence, she's more likely to have given birth to a calf in the past 5 years. So looking here on the right, the group of right whales that are using the Gulf of St. Lawrence are very consistent. It's the same 40% of the population. And on this bar chart, we're just looking at adult reproductive females. So fewer reproductive females are using the Gulf of St. Lawrence, as shown in this bar on the left, and more are not using the Gulf of St. Lawrence. However, of the females that are using the Gulf of St. Lawrence, about half of them have given birth to a calf since this shift occurred, whereas only a quarter of the non-Gulf of St. Lawrence animals have given birth. So perhaps this is an indication that the Gulf of St. Lawrence is in fact a reasonable foraging habitat. This is a similar type of graph style that my undergrad student made, and she was asking the question: if a mother uses the Gulf of St. Lawrence, see this shift to the Gulf of St. Lawrence is really this amazing ecological experiment. We don't have a lot of precedents of an animal population splitting into two groups and starting to use their territory really differently. And so she wanted to know, if a mother was more likely to use the Gulf of St. Lawrence, is her offspring more likely to use it? We don't really have any studies that look at culture, communication, or family patterns and behavior in this population. And she found that out of those Gulf of St. Lawrence mothers, about 70% of their offspring were also using the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The moms that don't use the Gulf of St. Lawrence, about 75% of those offspring don't use the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So this is the first evidence of behavioral patterns being transferred from mom to offspring. Okay, so I gave you a lot of information about climate and right whales and prey and how those impact right whale reproduction and mortality rates. The real question on everybody's mind is, if right whales keep shifting their distribution, how can we effectively protect them? So in this last bit, I just want to talk to you about some of the ways we're trying to improve our ability to protect right whales. So as a reminder, the big problems are ship strikes and fishing gear entanglement. So about 50% of necropsies, of dead animals that were assessed for cause of death, they can be attributed to ship strikes. And that's what this image is at the top. We're seeing propeller wounds on a dead beached right whale. And more than 80% of right whales in the population have been entangled in fishing gear at some point in their life. This image here at the bottom shows a whale that's been entangled around its mouth. And that's really the most severe kind of entanglement because it means this right whale really can't forage. And then here at the bottom, I say conservation actions rely on knowing where the whales are. This is really important to understand, and it's really hard to figure out where right whales are. So here's some technologies that we're using. We're putting hydrophones in the water to listen for right whale vocalizations. My lab is running analysis on this pink buoy off of Norfolk, so near you guys, and this buoy that's marked in gray off of Savannah. And this data is being collected in real time. So around the clock, at night on Christmas morning, my lab is looking at these acoustic data to determine whether or not our right whale detection has been heard. This is what some of that data looks like. Here, these vocalizations marked with a 4. This is a repeated pulse of a fin whale. And then here, these pitch tracks is what we call them. These sounds marked with the number 6 are right whale upcalls, like And so we would mark this as a right whale and implement some protections around this buoy. Down here is just some junky noise. This is mostly what we see. We rarely get to see these beautiful, clean whale vocalizations. And this is the rare but gratifying example of all of this effort working. So this is our buoy off of Norfolk. And in April, when most of the right whales were expected to be up in Cape Cod Bay, we actually heard very clearly a right whale on this Norfolk buoy, and were able to implement a temporary slowdown. So vessels greater than 65 feet long are encouraged to slow down to less than 10 knots to reduce the chance of a vessel strike. We're doing the same kind of work with a glider. So those buoys that I showed you are fixed in space, but a glider can move on its own and collect the same kind of data. We're especially interested in running gliders off of Charleston and Savannah, where right whales are coming down here to use the calving ground, but the compliance, vessel compliance to the speed zones are very poor. So we're really interested in boosting real-time detection because we hope that it will further motivate vessel captains to comply to the speed zones. This is sort of a trajectory of one of these Slocum gliders. It flies up and down in the water column, and we program it to come up to the surface every few hours and send its data to satellite and then back to us, where we can analyze it in real time on shore. And this is a picture of us. This is me, and this is my grad student and some of my colleagues. Oh boy. And we're going to throw a glider into the water off the coast of Savannah. These are just the results. This is the path of our glider off the coast of Savannah, Georgia. We were only able to run it for 2 weeks, but we heard some right whales in that time. And it felt important because during those days that we ran the glider, there were no airplane surveys that were able to run at that time. So we were the only ones out there detecting right whales in real time. We're doing some more work. This is me and my students doing a lot of work to set up a mooring for a hydrophone that just sits at the bottom of the water column. That's pictured up here. It's called a sound trap. And we deployed these hydrophones off the coast again of Savannah, Georgia, in this array. And we want to know, are right whales mostly inshore, or are they using this area farther offshore that is not actually designated as critical habitat? And this is what one of our hydrophones look like when it's deployed on the seafloor. This is after 7 months, so it's collected a lot of biofouling. Finally, our goal is well, one of our goals is to start to look at how right whales are using the space off of Long Bay. So this is the border between North and South Carolina, and this is a wind energy lease site that is expected to be developed in the next 10 years. And so we want to start putting hydrophones here around this wind lease site so we can get some baseline data of how right whales are using this area, especially when they're not being patrolled by aerial surveillance, which is the vast majority of the year. So eventually we're hoping some of our data will be useful for responsible offshore energy development. Those are the techniques that we're trying to use at this point, but it's a rapidly changing field. So improvements in right whale detection capabilities are hopefully going to keep going. We're hoping at some point we can start to detect right whales from satellite. So resolution is the big problem there, but that's really going to be a game changer. Other solutions could potentially be tagging, but right whale tagging also has some risks because the tag implants itself into the blubber, which could potentially cause injury or infection. So these are different technologies that we're trying to weigh so that we can improve our mitigation strategies and avoid this mismatch between the space that right whales are using and the locations that we're protecting in the ocean. So thanks to my collaborators, my students, and my funders, and I'm happy to take any questions.